Hello, my name's Mark Vernon, and I wanted to talk about John Vervaeke's latest YouTube lecture in his series Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. It's episode 23, where he gets to Romanticism. Now, it doubly interested me, partly because I think Romanticism has got really important clues as to how to awaken from the meaning crisis today. But even more so because in his lecture, John Vervaeke mentions a book by Gary Lachman called Lost Knowledge of the Imagination. And I think that's a really important book because he talks about the Oxford inkling and thinker Owen Barfield. Owen Barfield himself engaged with Romanticism. He argued that Romanticism needs to come of age and try to explain how that might come about. Now, I've picked up Barfield's thread in my own way, in fact, and have a book coming out in August, A Secret History of Christianity, which, if this interests you, the book might interest you too. That's enough for the plug. But let me try and say what John Vervaeke was saying and how Owen Barfield's ideas connect into that. Now, in the lecture, John Vervaeke begins with Descartes, talks about the reaction to that, which I think is covered in previous episodes, but really kind of gets going when he comes to the figure of Immanuel Kant. And Kant makes this very important assumption that kind of launches his own philosophical project, which is that when we know things, when we engage with the world, when we search our feelings, when we know our reason and our imagination, we can't know the world in itself. We can't know the thing in itself. As it were, there's an unbridgeable gap between ourselves and the world around us. And that what we're doing with our critical faculties is filtering what comes at us from the outside world. And with our filters, which are also constructive, making reason, making meaning, so that we feel we can navigate and find our way through life. This is the kind of burden which we conscious beings must bear, that we can't know the thing in itself, but that we can find a way that is located within, formed by these kind of cognitive cultural filters that present a coherent world and so make us feel like we can live lives. So there is meaning, if you like, but the price is that it's meaning located within the prison of our own minds, located only externally, never really fully knowing how it connects with the world around and about us. This was the kind of Kantian turn. He called it a Copernican revolution because whilst it tells us something about meaning, there's a great price we pay, which is to not know about the world in itself. It's a kind of another decentering, a bit like the Earth being decentered from the centre of the cosmos. So that's the Kantian move. Now, just as an aside, actually, John Vervaeke doesn't mention Kant's moral thought, because actually when he comes to his moral reasoning, Kant kind of opens a door, you might say, a little crack onto the world itself. Partly because he reasons that if morality is true, which he thought it is, he was a sort of moral realist, he thought it must also be the case that what we can actually do with our lives must connect with the world around us, otherwise it couldn't be moral realism. And he also wondered whether our intuitions about what's good and the way that we get drawn to beautiful things might be, as it were, reality finding its way through our filters to some degree. When we come to maybe not our rational faculties, but maybe to our moral or our aesthetic faculties, there may be more connection there than he otherwise allows. Now that's a really important little sort of crack, which Romanticism then really picks up on. And what Romanticism says is that our imaginations project onto the world, and so light the world back up again, if you like. We receive but what we give, was Coleridge's way of putting it. Coleridge being really important for introducing Kant's ideas to the English-speaking world. But it raises another question, which is whether when we project out onto the world with our feeling, through poetry, through art, through music, again, are we really connecting with the world around and about? Or are we still in this prison? It may not be a rational prison, it may be a very expressive prison, but it leaves that question still open. And so what you get after the Romantic movement, in post-Romantic Europe particularly, so this is all the way through the 19th century into the 20th and still in the 21st, is two broad post-Romantic responses. One is nihilistic, which Vervaeke picks it up in his lecture when he talks particularly about Nietzsche. Nietzsche is sometimes called the last Romantic. And Nietzsche fosters this idea that it's through our will to power that we can make meaning, if only we're brave enough. So we do project, he thought, onto a void, onto empty space. But nonetheless, we can still live if we can manage to brave the void. A really recent incarnation of this philosophy in popular culture would be the writings of Richard Dawkins, when he moves away from his science writing and becomes more of a moralist, saying, no, we must brave the world we find ourselves in. Even if science tells us it's empty, we must brave it. And that's picking up from that response to Romanticism. And then there's another response, the second response, which is in a way more ecstatic. What it tries to do, I think, not always consciously, but what it's trying to do is fill up the void with feeling. So it gets into peak experiences. It manifests, for example, in the interest in drugs and the hope that the way that psychedelic drugs seem to unleash your mind inside, and there's the hope that actually that those vivid experiences, those peaks, are connecting with the world around you too, and so are telling you something that's true. They're cleansing the doors of perception and showing you there's an infinity beyond, to use William Blake's expression. I think there's a lot of 20th and 21st century, particularly Christianity, that's like this as well. It's a kind of ecstatic, charismatic Christianity that particularly majors on, say, the love of a figure like Jesus. And you're encouraged Sunday by Sunday to fall again in love with Jesus, to sing these very kind of affecting songs, but with the sort of suspicion, is this really true? Is it just pure feeling? And so alongside this kind of Christianity comes almost endless efforts to justify Christianity, endless efforts in apologetics to try to sort of make it stack up as well. And I think that this is partly what Owen Barfield's great friend C.S. Lewis got into, and why C.S. Lewis is so very popular. Because on the one hand, he does the imaginative side with things like the Narnia stories, but he also does the rational side, trying to make the Christianity he senses is round and about him, try to make it stack up rationally as well. But it's an uneasy, unsettled kind of position to be in. People find they have to kind of keep trying to repeat the peak experience, whether it be with the psychedelics or other kinds of ecstasy, or whether it's by going to church and having a wonderful praise session again. It leaves us sort of slightly unsure. And this is where a third element comes in, which John Vervaeke also talked about in his lecture, a third post-romantic response. And this is the response of psychotherapy, particularly Freud and Jung. Now, in the lecture, Vervaeke talks about Freud and Jung turning inwards and trying to discern inner life. It's almost kind of saying, if you can't know the thing in itself, if you can't know the world round and about for sure, at least you can know your inner life for sure. And Freud has his response to it, which is to say that your inner life is populated with your own personal kind of imaginings, things which you've introjected, that you've kind of conjured from within, from your own life. And Jung takes that and adds another dimension, which is the collective unconscious, the idea that we inherit a kind of inner life too, much like we inherit fingers from our physiological evolutionary past. So too we inherit a kind of collective psyche. And so Jung's program of psychotherapy wasn't just to learn how to relate to the personal unconscious, but also to the collective unconscious, to watch out for when it overwhelms us, when it's too much for the ego, and learn how to undergo those experiences, try and make meaning of them, which really is about the ego trying to learn how to relate to them, to the big self, as Carl Jung put it. But neither Freud nor in fact Jung stopped there. Jung particularly says different things at different times. He's one of these quite complicated figures to pin down, because at other times he seems to be saying other things. And in particular, Jung at times says it's not actually just about your kind of inner psychology. It's not just about the inner world and what's going on inside, but that this might connect with the external reality, with the divine even, certainly with nature and the cosmos as well. It's telling you something true about the outer world. It is connecting with the thing in itself. And I think that Jung particularly got this from Coleridge, from Samuel Taylor Coleridge, figure who was so important for introducing Kant to the English-speaking world. Because what Coleridge realised is that there's actually two kinds of imagination. There is the fantastical imagination. There is the imagination which just sort of plays, that says silly things which may amuse, may unsettle, but doesn't really go anywhere. You know, it might imagine, I don't know, lips on a chicken. It might imagine unicorns. And they may be amusing, they may be troubling. They may tell us even something about our anger or about our inner life. But it doesn't really go anywhere. And so, you know, we have a dream one night and then a different dream the next night and a different dream after that. But that's only one type of imagination, which he called fantasy. And there is another type of imagination. And the thing that distinguishes this is that its imaginings last. We return to them time and time again. And then we notice that they become creative. They actually feel expansive of life. And they seem to connect us with the world around and about us. And particularly the post-Freudian British psychotherapist Donald Winnicott ran with this. And he made quite a simple observation in a way. He said, you know, if our inner lives were just isolated, were just our own, were just full of our own fantasies, then we'd never feel grounded in life. We'd never feel we belonged. And we never feel we really connected with others. And we'd be in this sort of constantly infantile state of, you know, trying to fall in love again, of trying to run with our imaginings, but always feeling slightly mad and even slightly psychotic with them. We never actually feel sane. We never feel whole people. And Winnicott argues that, you know, no doubt sometimes people can go into these slightly mad states, particularly when they either feel the emptiness or they feel the ecstasy. You know, falling in love would be a good case in point. But most people, most of the time, don't actually just stay in that kind of state. They move from falling in love, for example, to standing in love, to making something of their life. And civilizations too, they build on their perception of things to create forms, cultural forms, which are really very lasting and do have a sense of development and progress, do show that they can grow their sense of reality and not just, as it were, play on the surface of reality. So Donald Winnicott, as he put it, he said we have a kind of false self which dances and plays, but we also have a true self which perhaps connects to the more. Now Barfield himself too is very much in that kind of camp. He argued that we can go through these periods of alienation and uncertainty when we're not sure what's going on. But that's only one kind of participation in the world. There is another kind, which he called final participation. And again, as an aside, those of you who listen to John Vervaeke will know that participation is a key word for him. For Barfield, it means that full sense of connecting with the world, with others, with the cosmos and nature. And by full sense, he meant participating with all our faculties, with reason, yes, but also with imagination, and with feeling, yes, but also with kind of cognition, so that things can be built up in scientific enterprises or aesthetic enterprises. And we know when we're looking at final participation and not just playfulness, when we feel it is taking us somewhere, when, like Coleridge's imagination, we feel it's creative, it opens up, it feels expansive of the soul. And we are in this dynamic of reaching out, but something's returned, something real connects back with us, and there's this sense of connecting with the thing in itself. So Barfield cultivated this notion of a final participation, and he in particular took a lead from Christianity in that. He notices, again, something very obvious, that Christianity for about 1500 years was the dominant way that people felt connected to reality. It shaped the mind of our ancestors in the West, for many centuries. Clearly, it's undergone a crisis since the Reformation, since the Scientific Revolution, since the Enlightenment, since figures like Kant. But nonetheless, there's something, Barfield argued, for us to pick up from Christianity still and carry into this final participation. And it comes from the key Christian notion of incarnation. Now, the doctrine of the incarnation is that there was a figure who lived 2,000 years ago, Jesus, who also participated fully in the divine life. And so he was both God and human. And that's the sort of standard Christian confession. But Barfield takes a lead from Christian mysticism, particularly figures like Meister Eckhart, who said, look, the real incarnation that matters is not the one that happened 2,000 years ago. That was the one that just awoke us to a different way of participating in life. Because the real incarnation that matters now is the one that's happening within our souls now. It's when external reality, outer life, even divine life, is seen to be mirrored and reflected and connected, participated, you might say, in our own inner lives, when there is this sense of joining and expansion. So the sort of Christianity now, Barfield argued, would major on this, would cultivate the ways that people might know of the incarnation, the bringing to body, you might say, of not just divine life, but external reality in their own lives, and so join it up, so integrate it, you might say. It's a kind of awakening of consciousness that realizes it's not just my consciousness, but the consciousness of the whole world that I'm awakening to. So this is Barfield's notion of final participation, this incarnational idea. Now, I think that we're at the beginnings of this emergence of final participation, and figures like John Vervaeke, others in the emergence movement, the integral movement, very much onto this idea. But Barfield has a particular contribution to make to it, which I unpack in my book and will unpack in further talks. But let me just say now how I think this final participation is emerging, say, in roughly 4 stages. The first stage I think you can call the kind of chaotic stage, and this is the more fantastical stage. This is when someone goes on a trip and has an amazing experience that's hard to put down, but at the same time they don't quite know what to make of it. It's the New Age movement, what the philosopher Charles Taylor called the supernovae of modern quests for meaning, where there's experiments here, experiments there. Some of it's wild and wacky, some of it seems to make sense, some of it's misguided. I think of things like quantum spirituality in this category, sort of reaching for a bit of physics which itself is not really well understood, but sort of making resonances, trying to draw analogies. It's a kind of chaotic experiment, easy to mock, but I think actually important still, because it is an attempt to connect to reality round and about, to know the thing in itself, to move beyond the pure Kantian movement. So that'd be the first stage, the first stage of this kind of chaotic attempt to participate afresh. It settles down a bit and learns how to speak about itself more coherently in the second stage, which I think of as the kind of wonder stage. It's the stage that you find, say, in a lot of nature writing, the kind of nature writing that can bring together the science, but also elicit a felt sense, not just of your own response to nature, but seems to be opening up nature in itself to you as well. And actually, I think a lot of science writing does this too. It's still officially atheistic. It's still officially saying there isn't an inner life in the cosmos, and there's certainly no divinity that underpins it all, that holds life in a kind of divine life. But nonetheless, it can't quite put that idea down too. It seems to be moving in that direction, and so fills us with wonder and with a sense that somehow we can't quite just be in this void, that the nihilistic response isn't quite enough. So that'd be a second stage, the kind of wonder stage, which is a bit more coherent. Books can be written about it, and they feel like they're opening you up to something. They take you to a kind of edge, and you wonder what's over the edge. Great nature and science writing does this. It leads to a third stage, which I think is the kind of discernment stage. And I think this particularly begins with therapy. I work as a psychotherapist, so a bit why wouldn't I say this? But I think what psychotherapy is about is, first of all, beginning to discern your own inner life of fantasy, this kind of more chaotic way of things, and then realizing that there is a kind of inner imagination that tells you something really true about yourself. It begins by helping you make sense of your own story, building up your own narrative, seeing how you got to where you are as an individual. But it doesn't actually stop there in therapy, because when you discern your own inner life, you, as it were, move to an edge of your personal inner life. And there you start to realize that the world around you can be detected, as it were. It starts to speak to you afresh. People start noticing things like synchronicities. They start realizing their dreams might be telling them more than just about themselves. They also have different experience of time. In the therapy room, sometimes time chugs away a bit like clock time, but sometimes it moves into a different experience of time, something that feels a bit more timeless actually, and you realize that in the depths of the psyche it's a kind of eternity, a kind of timelessness. That's a very different experience of what it is to be in the world, and that reaches beyond just your own story and brings in the story of your culture, and even the divine story, I think. Moves into spirituality, you might say, moves into a kind of mysticism. So that's a really important stage, this stage of discernment, that can understand when you're in fantasy and when you're in proper imaginative creativity in Coleridge's sense, that reaches out to reality and has reality speaking back to you, knowing the thing in itself. This is very much connected to the idea of developmental psychology, people like Robert Kegan and so on too, who I think are onto this in their own way. I don't actually think of it as a linear development. I'll talk more about this in another talk, but it's much more like a kind of return to an earlier sense of participation, but with this crucial notion of self-consciousness, self-awareness. It's a way of discerning what our deep ancestors would have talked about in myth, for example. They would have felt fated, whereas we can feel free with this new self-consciousness. So it's kind of adding something to that which was before, rather than being the more straightforwardly linear notions of development which you get in people like, say, Ken Wilber. There's a lot more to be said about that. But for now, let me finish by sort of saying how I think maybe 4 things happen when you start to reach this phase of discernment. So this would be a kind of final stage, which you might call sort of true knowledge, marked by 4 things. Final participation, let me say, rather than true knowledge. Final participation marked by 4 things. One would be that you become less interested in morality and much more interested in virtue. Now, by morality, I mean the shoulds and shouldn'ts, moral issues, moral causes, the kind of things which do fill up the culture wars now. That starts to become less interesting, and instead you get more interested in the virtues of your character, who you are in yourself. And the reason this becomes interesting is because you realize that virtues are actually tuning yourself to be able to perceive more of the world around you. They're like cleaning the window of perception of virtues, and they take you into the external world, so that, as it were, you can tolerate whatever's happening, but discern it as well. I think that's what virtues like goodness and courage, temperance, wisdom, and that's what they enable you to do. So if you find yourself getting less interested and less anxious about moral issues, and more interested in who you are in yourself and how that enables you to resonate with the world around you through your character, through your personality, I think that's another good indicator of this move towards final participation. That would be one. A second one would be kind of how you love. And in particular, I think that it's a kind of love that moves from a possessiveness, the desire to have and to hold, the desire to feel secure, say, in a relationship that's sort of tied up and that's free of doubt. And instead is the kind of love that seeks to praise, that wants to enjoy, that wants to flow with and go with. again, you can perhaps sort of see this, how it's the move from a kind of love that wants to grab and hold within, to a love that wants to praise by moving from within to without. It's kind of giving love. I think this is why people talk a lot about the ego now, and are wondering what the ego is all about, because there's a kind of ego love that wants to have, that bigs up the ego, but there's also a kind of ego love that's actually quite comfortable with itself. It loves itself enough, you might say, to sort of let go of itself, and then to use that sight of discernment and awareness, that sight of participation, to praise and to love the world round and about. So I think that's another kind of key indicator of this move to final participation, the move from a kind of possessiveness to a kind of praise of the world round and about, a different take on this dynamic of love. A fourth one would be the cultivation of wisdom, and it's a move, I think, from kind of rule-based wisdom to law-based wisdom. You know, the kind of sense that if you've got 10 or 12 things sorted in your life, then life will tend to go well. That can be a very useful first stage. But wisdom proper becomes flexible. It's actually a response to the moment. And it knows that what might be the appropriate thing to do at one time is not the appropriate thing to do at another time. It's a kind of practical intelligence, a practical knowledge that can play with reality in the sense of providing the next stepping stone, just the next model, you might say, the next moment of illumination that expands life, that wisely takes you back into life, so that you can again know the thing in itself. So the move from a sort of rule-based approach to things to one that's much more flexible, you might say a kind of living wisdom. When you feel yourself going into that zone, into that mode, I think that too is a kind of final participation. That's the third. And then the fourth one I just wanted to mention for now is the sense that this is freeing. It's to move into a kind of freedom. It's to move away from the old fear of either the void, the nihilistic fears, or actually the secret fear that's embedded in the heart of ecstasy, the fear that you've got to get the next sort of peak experience, the next great religious moment, for fear that that'll sort of disappear and leave you empty. That fear starts to die, and it's replaced by a sort of fearlessness which is characterized by freedom. It's knowing that although the world in itself might throw all sorts of things at you, and ultimately will bring death in itself, and also the little endings, the little deaths that go on the way, nonetheless there's a connection with the world in itself that knows there's something beyond that, there's something more than that, that life, as it were, itself is the prior state of being. In the old Christian dispensation, this was the notion of death and resurrection. Again, you know, something which Christians said happened 2,000 years ago, and we can kind of prove now and prove that Christianity is true, much like the incarnation. I think no, Barfield said that kind of Christianity's got to go, and instead we've got to know death and resurrection in ourselves now, which means knowing that we can move beyond ourselves to life in all its fullness, to life that's the thing in itself. That's the world, the divine in itself now. I think, you know, Jesus himself might have left little clues actually to this, as is recorded in the gospel, when he says these really fascinating things to the disciples, like, you know, after his resurrection, he says, "Do not cling to me." It's sort of saying this has got to be known in yourself now. The resurrection appearances are these very strange appearances where he's there one minute and then not the next. And again, I think this is handing over the thing which you might say he himself has discovered to the disciples, so they can know the thing in themselves. And it's a freeing moment. Whenever you feel yourself going towards a kind of newfound freedom, the old fears start to fall away. That's another key test. So this final participation, you know, it's the move from morality, from ethics, issues, to virtues, to the cultivation of your character that enables a perception. It's when you feel love moving from a kind of possessive I must have to a praise I can give. The ego wants to share rather than to know in the more possessive sense. It's the fourth thing, which is the notion that wisdom is a kind of practical playfulness with reality, where a rule that was true one minute actually becomes a very different rule that's true the next. And so the old law-based approach gives way to a kind of practical intelligence that moves with the flow. And then finally, I think it's the notion that fear, the old fears that perhaps Kant instilled in us when he said, yes, we can know things, but at the price that we're trapped in our minds. The fear that the Nietzschean moment brings, that there is this void, but we need to cultivate the will to power to kind of brave it. When that fear itself kind of gives away into a newfound freedom, a new play and joyfulness with life. That too, according to Owen Barfield, is this new final participation. There's lots more to say about this. Maybe John Vervaeke too will be saying more about this in subsequent episodes of his series, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. I shall certainly try and say more too.